Full. Of course, I welcome all of you. I welcome the professors, my colleagues, and all of you coming, leaving your classes and coming. I'm especially pleased to present Professor Robert Brown. Professor Brown is a professor of architecture in the School of Art, Design and Architecture at the University of Plymouth in the United Kingdom. He is also the leader of the Master of Architecture program at the same school and is the founder and co-leader of the Urban Dialogues Research Network there. He is also a visiting professor at City University of Macau. And as a side note, I just learned last night that he is a fan of science fiction, and that has influenced a lot of his publications. Those different roles that Professor Brown played have put him in a unique position of being well aware of what is occurring in the education of architecture in the UK. In Plymouth and in the UK in general, he chose to present some of his insights about that, especially as a response to the questions that you guys have posed to him in your student meeting last summer while he was visiting as an external examiner. I think we are privileged to have this chance to get his insights on architecture education, and I intend to listen closely to what he is saying, and I really hope that you do the same. We have the room, I think, till 4 p.m. So Professor Brown, kindly 4:30, then, as long as we need it. We have the room as long as we need it. Hehowever, Professor Brown thinks it would be good to have part of today as a presentation where he's gonna show us something about the architecture of education in the UK, and the other part is a discussion. So I think we will have 1 hour of a presentation, and then I really encourage all of you to bring out your notes, take notes, write down your questions to have an enriching discussion at the end. I want it to be as brief as possible.
That's good.
You have the floor.
Okay, thank you. All right, thank you everybody for coming. Before I get going, can everybody hear me clearly? Am I speaking loud enough? And am I enunciating clearly so you can understand my American accent by way of the UK? That's all fine? Good, all right. Before I get started, just want to express thanks to Professor Sharif Al-Fiki for this opportunity, also to Ramy, instrumental in all my visits here, and also to all of the staff and students here for the opportunity to speak. So thank you. Assalamu alaikum. So, yeah, just going to quickly introduce myself, also introduce something about this lecture, why it's happening, and why I had the very nice privilege of sitting in on one of the studios this morning. As you may know, my role generally in coming to this university is as an external examiner. So last summer was my first visit. I will be coming for 3 more visits, God willing. And in that role, I come in and provide critical feedback to your professors about how they're teaching, how they're marking things, the overall orientation of the school. So I have a rather privileged position. I come in and go, hey, you guys have to do this. And I think that's a bit unfair. It's a bit of me literally flying in, appearing all of a sudden and making critical comments. And so I suggested to your professors that this should be a more reciprocal relationship, and that I should also put myself on display or show or open myself up to critique, because they do the same to me. They take your work, which in a way is critique, but it's really about how they're teaching you that is opened up to my critique, and I think that's a bit one-sided. So I suggested, I'm happy to do something. They suggested I would come in the studios, but also to give a lecture. So it's in that spirit that I'm offering this up. What I'm saying can be contested, challenged, critiqued, because that's the way we learn, okay? So if you disagree with something, and particularly at the end, feel free to speak up. If you disagree with something in the middle of it and you just can't wait, you're also welcome to speak up, okay? It's meant to be a dialogue. This is not a situation where I'm talking at you. I would rather have that exchange. I will try to be quick. I've got a lot of information that I want to go through. So some of it, I confess, I will fly through. Some of it I don't think I need to spend a lot of time on. There are things that you know. There's other things that I really want to spend a bit more time talking about. But before I do that, just want to introduce myself. Graduated from the University of Illinois in the States. Worked as an architect in Chicago for a number of years, doing houses for the rich and famous, and also did arts projects and community-based housing or regeneration in the UK, and also carried on doing that in other places around the world. And as Ramy kindly pointed out, professor of architecture, and I've had the very distinct privilege of being able to teach at a number of different schools around the world. And that's something I really value, this opportunity to have exchange. One of the things that Ramy didn't mention, but part of my remit, is I also sit on the RIBA Education Committee. So that means I get to see what a lot of different schools are doing. And that's useful for me because I'm able to kind of contribute that when I come here to speak to everybody. Also, my research interests, apart from science fiction, which is part of it, also include ideas of place and sociocultural identity, urbanism, or the making of cities, and pedagogy, how we teach. And weaving through all of those in a strange way is science fiction. But today's talk isn't about science fiction, though Ramy suggested maybe I should have, but next time. Next time. So, as has been pointed out, whenever I do this, in terms of coming here or going to your sister academies in Alexandria, Smart Village, or other places I've been around the world, students always ask one question. How do we compare to the UK and other places? Completely understand that question. Very understandable why you do it. To answer this, I'm going to give you a short answer, and I mean short, and I'm going to give you a long answer. And the way I'm going to give you the long answer is by talking about a little bit about the BA architecture program at my own university, and I'm going to be talking about mostly the master's program at my university because that's what I teach. And throughout all of this, I'm going to be showing some examples of work. So mostly when you see images, it's of something of Plymouth, like the image on the screen. This is the atrium in our building. We had this exhibition, a bunch of students gathered there. So the things that you'll see somehow will relate to my university. When it doesn't, I'll let you know, okay? But that should be obvious. Anyway, so that's the kind of premise of this talk. I want to address this question. How do we compare to the UK? Short answer is you do. Good students do good or do well anywhere. I don't care what school you're going to. If you are engaged, enthusiastic, are willing to take challenges, to challenge yourself, you will do well. Whatever school you go to, you will do good work. It doesn't matter where you go. It is up to you as a student at university or higher education level. It's really about what you bring to it and what you want to explore. And as I've found, and as education research has found, the more that you move through higher education, the more and more you're learning from your fellow students. I mean no disrespect to your professors, but it's really about student-to-student learning that really is where things start to accelerate. So what we're trying to do as professors is just kind of create this atmosphere in which you can interact and learn. So the short answer, yeah, you compare. Long answer is you don't. And the reason why I say you don't, this is maybe a phrase, I hope it makes sense here, it's like comparing apples and oranges. You can't compare them. They are different. An apple doesn't taste like an orange, so it becomes hard to say which one's better, how do they compare? They don't. They're so different. And what I want to do is explore that, and maybe the question should be not about how do we compare what we are doing, but rather how you are doing it, and very significantly, why you are doing it. And that may be where a bit of the interest is in terms of how things compare. This picture is obviously not connected with the University of Plymouth from the movie The Fountainhead, if you've ever seen it. If you haven't, go see it. Conventional notion of practice, inherited ideas of architectural education is there's a certain mode of practice, and what education is doing is trying to prepare students for that practice. It's a very understandable remit or agenda. The challenge in this is the world is changing and architectural practice is changing. So what is architectural education to do? These are things, it's a changing world. The population of the world is going to increase by almost 50% in 30 years' time. It's an increasingly urbanized world. We've already got to 50% of the people in the world living in cities. Again, by 2050, 70% of the world's population will be in cities. There's ecological challenges. Economic systems are changing. Cheap fossil fuels coming to an end. And there's been a huge shift in the world. Once upon a time, dare I say, the world kind of focused on Western Europe and the Americas. That's not the case anymore. The real places where there's energy, excitement, things are happening, Africa, Middle East, Asia. If that's where, if you want to be where the center of stuff is, that's more of where it's happening. Europe's kind of, dare I say, a bit tired, and America is increasingly, with our current president, shooting itself in the foot. I could say other things, but it wouldn't be polite, so just leave it at that. Practice isn't changing in terms of the nature of the work. Used to be all these UK architects doing all this work in the UK. 55% of the work that UK architects do is outside the UK. 50% of the work that architects do are not, as I'm the leader of the project, we are working for contractors, a builder who then hires us. Increasing emphasis on urban issues. So just the whole places that we work is changing, and who we work for is changing. Changing forms of practice. Used to be an architect running a firm or partners running a firm doing architectural work. Much more in the way of multidisciplinary work, cross-disciplinary work, collaborative practice, and very importantly, research-informed practice. This is really gaining steam in the UK, this idea of doing research and it being core to how you practice. Changing practice types. This is an interesting statistic across the UK. This isn't just University of Plymouth. 50% of the students who enter into architectural education in the UK do not go on to work in architecture. They go do something else. Furniture design, landscape architecture, website design, blah, blah, blah. It would be like me coming over here and just going, you have fun, go off and do architecture. You have fun, go off and do something else. That is just the reality in the UK. So as educators, we've got to keep in mind that half our students aren't even going to be working in the field of architecture. So we have to think about what it is we're teaching them. And so education needs to change in response to this. And this is one of the things that's happened in the UK, because it recognizes it has this very changed condition. We need to prepare students able to go out, ready to practice architecture or to practice other things. We've got to prepare them for an environment that is just changing so much. In my lifetime, which is increasingly longer, unsurprisingly, but feeling it a bit more, things have changed so much. When I was a student, computers just weren't even on the agenda. It was my final year of university where computers were introduced into design studios. To put that in perspective, my university is where they developed the Super Cray computer, which once upon a time was the most powerful computer in the world. Renowned computer engineering department. We didn't have it till my final year of university. You guys, oh wait, my computer's not working, I'll get out my iPhone. Geez, you guys are so quick. None of that existed when I was a student. Environmental issues, we didn't care about, hey, just drive your car. We didn't, all these things that are part of what you're having to contend with, we didn't have to. I can't even begin to imagine what your life as an architect or whatever it may be is going to be like in 30 years' time. But it won't necessarily, certainly in the context of the UK, be what the state of play is now in terms of how architects are practicing. It's just evolving so much. So again, The view in the UK, certainly at my school, is we've got to prepare students for this incredibly changing world. So what I want to do is explore this, what we're doing at Plymouth, by talking about something I'll refer to as critical inquiry towards praxis. Praxis being a form of practice that's underpinned by an intellectual rigor. It's underpinned by theory. It is about a critical reflection on what is it that we are doing and being critical about our practice and informing it. That's the word praxis. And we carry out this critical inquiry to develop or support the students to develop their own form of praxis, which is very different from the way it was, say, 30 years ago in the UK. We're educating them to be a sole practitioner doing houses. That was kind of the model that existed. It's become something very different. This is the last slide. This is where I run into trouble. So I'm going to try and go up here because I've got other stuff to show. Okay. Right, now I'm probably going to need help. Sure. But I'm trying, I think it's this one. Macau site. Right. Slideshow. This is going to happen a lot. So what I need to do to talk about this idea of critical inquiry towards praxis, what we've been doing in the MArch program, is I'm going to show primarily one project or one student's project. There's actually two students working together, but impromptu a challenge brought up over lunch. I'm actually going to have to show a second project or second student, but I'm going to do that very quickly at the end because that's part of what we're doing. It's about supporting students to find their own way. And so I need to show kind of two different alternatives, but I'm going to focus on one, so bear with me. So that's what I'm going to kind of do. And to put that in the context, I need to tell you where we were working, because that's hugely, hugely important to how we work, idea of the site. So we were working in Macau, now part of China. It used to be a Portuguese colony. So moving a bit closer, sitting on the southeastern edge, China, and in this image, we're moving in closer. Macau is part of the Pearl River Delta. There's about 40 million people living there. Factory of the world. Hong Kong's right across the water. Shenzhen is there. So huge kind of area. Moving in closer, there's Macau, and then this other area called Cotai, which is two former islands of Taipa and Kolane. So it's just these kind of three bits right here. It's arguably the world's densest city. It's so packed with so many people. It's very, very small, denser than Hong Kong and other places. Macau is best known because it's got a bunch of buildings like this, casinos. Chinese government gave permission to Macau to kind of liberalize the casino economy. It always had one, and everybody went crazy. It's kind of like Disneyland or Las Vegas on steroids. Just all these big buildings, and they're all lit up at night, and any shape you could ever imagine, well, somebody's there doing it. So that's the kind of context we're working in. But also Macau is that. You see that big kind of building in the background that was all lit up? Well, this is the other side of it. Just everyday streets going on. Kind of a Google Earth view, incredibly dense, packed city with some stuff down in the kind of bottom and lower right-hand corner all spread out. This is where casinos and government buildings are, but the upper left-hand side, just that packed urban environment. There's an aerial view. You see all these incredible high-rises. It looks a bit like Manhattan, all these things rising up 50, 60, 70 stories. Where we were working was in the kind of area right over here, this kind of forgotten portion of land that was the original Chinatown. The Portuguese had settled it as a colony. They had their old town, and they didn't allow the Chinese in, and so the Chinese inhabited this area that was not the nice bit of land, and it's always been the poor bit of Macau. And we are invited by the Macau Association of Architects to look at this, to see what our students could explore in terms of how this area could be regenerated. So that is the area we're looking at. I'll leave that now. You'll get to see more of it in a little bit. Is this pace okay?
Yeah.
So now, it should be 0, 0, this one? Yeah. Should be, yeah? All right. So, right. So, here we are at the beginning of the year. We do this thing called Project Zero. It means it's without any tutoring. We just ask the students to comment on a particular issue. This year, we asked them to think about, as it says in the title, place. Ask them to define what place is for them, how they think about that word place, common word in architecture. This student happens to be into fishing. So this idea of kind of casting a line out into the landscape, just part of how she thinks. She's always been interested in fishing. And these images, we ask them to write a bit of text and produce imagery. This image is kind of taken from her and her idea of place and in the landscape fishing. So just a conceptual orientation. But a key word in this is that connection between place and line. All right, just keep that in mind. Place, line. Escape. This should be a movie. Yeah?
Yeah.
And the next thing I'm going to show you is that this is a thing that she did with some other students. We asked them to then move to a group project, and we're asking them to work with the idea of displace. Having defined place, what do we think about the idea of being displaced and how we respond to it? And we asked them to do this in the form of a movie, and we asked them to appropriate an existing movie and work in part with that, because we're interested in this idea of dialogue, and wanted them to explore issues of displacement. So she and her colleagues took this well-known cartoon, The Little Prince, and combined it with some footage from Plymouth to explore the idea of carrying forward an idea or interest she had about this idea of the role of a line in making place. They're exploring a line, but suggesting that it's not just about getting from point A to point B, but understanding that journey, the movement along the line is crucial, and the idea that I can step off the line, that I can start to explore. So it's a kind of theme that she's starting to extend this idea of the role of line in the making of place. Make sense? Cool. Okay. I hope that was all self-explanatory in the movie, but just in case. So now, let's go. So we took the students off to Macau, asked them to do what we call a mental mapping. Just go around the site, record your impressions, and make what we would call some representation. Again, a bit of text that went with this, where they're starting to formulate their thoughts, drawing upon relevant theory to frame their discussion or build up their praxis, but also create some sort of representation. And so this is her representation of her site in Macau, this thin strip of land, the former Chinese old town, kind of a harbor area, and she was picking up on this idea of lines. Particularly, there was a lack of connection from the land to the water. These layers had built up over time that limited people's access to the water, and at present there's all this kind of maritime industry in the way. And so she was just kind of recognizing the lack of lines. This is her way of representing that. So continuation of that theme. So in the interest of time, I'm going to jump ahead to that. Okay. Yep. And what we want to, I'm going to go to the film right there. I'm not going to start that yet. Okay, let me start. So I was very pleased to see this morning when we sat in on one of the studios here, people using film find it very relevant in terms of how architects practice, lateral way of thinking, getting us to see things anew. Also, arguably, it's a way of contending with the modern world. Cities, which are very complex places, all these things happening at once. You can see because my hands are flopping all over the place. I can't control myself. It's kind of like cities. There's just all this stuff happening. And the idea that movies or film is a way of trying to somehow express how multiple things are happening at once. So it's a medium we're encouraging our students to work with. And as I said, nice to see you guys were working with that. And what we do, and I was having a conversation over lunchtime, what we do is spend a bit of time with the students, getting them to try and articulate very clearly what their conceptual orientation is about. We're really trying to get them to define what their interest is and how they see the world and how that applies to the making of an architecture. Now that may seem easy, but it's not. The students end up having to do a lot of soul searching and kind of defining what is it that I'm really interested in. And because this is work being done in the final year of their studies, oh my God, it's so important. I've really got to get it right. So that there's a lot of pressure on them about how they define themselves. So I'm going to jump ahead. This is a movie that this student made with two other students that kind of encompasses their work. And what we have them do is work in two stages. They do a lot of work analyzing the site. And by analyzing the site, I'm talking about they're constructing knowledge of it. Constructing knowledge of it in the context of how they see the world. We're not asking them to go out and record factual information as much as we are asking them to think about what is it when I look at that landscape that I value or that I'm critical of. And we're getting them to make evaluations or judgments about that landscape in the context of their own orientation. And moving on from that, we then start to say, okay, let's make a proposition, but at the urban scale. We're trying to regenerate this area. So they're working at the scale generally of a neighborhood. Sometimes people start to talk about the city or the wider region. In this case, they're talking about a neighborhood. What sort of things could we do to regenerate the area? So this film I'm going to show is a combination of their contextual analysis, but it also leads into the proposition. It lasts about 7 minutes. So hopefully this will play nice and hunky-dory. At the beginning of this movie, there's no sound because when they introduce this, they're doing a bit of voiceover, talking about issues that are important to them, place and identity, genus loci, or spirit of place, value in the everyday, common ground, relationship between self and the other, with other people.
Macau is one of the few places in the world where East meets West. Wandering a little way from its old European-looking waterfront, we come upon street after street of ancient China. Like another world, oriental with pagoda-roofed buildings, ornamented balconies, gay banners painted with fantastic Chinese characters, and a constant parade of China's teeming millions pattering along in their wooden slippers, hurrying with their heavily loaded baskets, or trotting over the hot cobbled streets with primitive rickshaws.
think that's about it. So hopefully you can see the kind of clear connection, the student interested in line, idea of how that can be used as a device to make place, carrying over into this urban strategy, working with the edge and this line that starts to connect distinct points. And each of those distinct points has the intervention of a line that's starting to try and find a way of reconnecting this forgotten part of the city with the water. And then there's more conventional drawings that they were doing that I'll quickly try and show. So that was a kind of movie they made. And let's see. So this was the culmination of kind of semesters worth of work, this urban strategy. They made that film. They have these kind of conventional drawings that are showing bits that you would have seen in the film, but segments, and this was about an AO size. That was the kind of thing that went on display publicly, along with the film that was shown publicly. I won't go into detail about the scheme. I'm not trying to explain the scheme so much, but explain how they're working. But they've got this kind of key collection of drawings that are meant to communicate the scheme. And then, I won't go through this, but just to give you a taste of this. We also have, also have them make these booklets. It's them trying to capture the design process that they are working through. And I'm just going to flip through some of this. And as I said, it's just trying to capture the kind of, all right, that's not doing it. That's all right. This one. Okay. I'll skip the kind of table of contents. So that's stuff you've seen. They're talking about their work in Macau, drawing on their earlier work, theoretical framework, their movie that they've made together, and then a series of workshop studies where they're exploring this idea of line and how it's used to establish a connection to landscape. A lot of collaborative exercises, particularly some students in Macau, revisiting that when we came back from Macau. So when I was talking before about trying to work through what a concept meant or means to them, this is part of that. So just a continual kind of re-examination. Do they have their understanding right? And again, a series of workshop exercises, all kind of building up to an understanding of things. So I'm going to leave that go, but you can see there's this layering of information. There's this process of reiteration where they're trying to refine what is it that I'm trying to do here, and that leads to the formulation of this urban strategy. Make sense? Okay, I'll take that as kind of a yes. And then what I want to go to is, I'm going to jump way ahead. I'm just looking for the right thing.
لا ما انا فاهم، ما انا عارف، بس عشان بس اركز مع بس الشاشه باينه. لو عملت سمع متاخر الكلام في الشاشه مش هيبان.
Alright, I'm just going to go to this
ما
one.
دي الفكره. كانت مصنع ايه؟ كنت عملت زيتون عليه وفضلت حركت، كنت عملت زيتون عليه وفضلت
There you go. That's alright. And then they're working on the same thing in terms of generating a building in the context of their urban strategy. And we're very purposeful about getting them to think about, hey, you've developed this idea from the beginning of the year, Project Zero, through this film project, through an urban strategy, keep going with it. So this notion of a line and the role it has conceptually in generating a building. This is work done by this one student and another student together, and this was done over the course of a semester. And this is a recording of their work, and I was trying to find some final images which seem to have disappeared. And like that previous document I showed you, and this is kind of sideways, so that's no good.
دكتور معلش.
That's good. That doesn't, will that work for all of us?
دكتور معلش، دكتور رامي.
Okay.
مش
page
كنت اقول لك
down.
بس بالماوس صباعين ونعمل كده.
والله؟
مش كده كنت اقول لك.
So at the beginning of the talk, I was emphasizing this idea that what we're trying to do is get students to develop a praxis, a way of working. There is an end result that we're asking them to do, which is about the making of a building or a building proposition. But probably in the context of this school, you'd probably see it as a bit incomplete. That's fine. Don't have a problem with it. But what we are really emphasizing is them developing a working methodology, a process, or a praxis. This is how I want to work. And this document is evidence of how they're working. And it's just a recording of the different ways, particularly use of models. Really emphasize that, models. Sure you've heard that once or twice. And you can see, there's them making sense of things through the use of text, through reference to theoretical discourse, and a discussion of that, and trying to understand what that means in the real world through drawing upon precedents, whether it's things that are already existing on site or things that they're exploring. And I'm really going to flip through here for a moment. And now starting to test that idea in terms of this proposition in model form in the context of the site. You can see so far there's no conventional floor plans that are emerging yet. We're just trying to get them to understand, what do you mean this line? What does that line do to establish the making of a building? So we're trying to get them to tease out that thing conceptually. And there's various tests that we're doing, and there's again constant reference to theoretical discourse. We're using a lot of different methods to get them to work. And they start to develop this thing referred to as palimpsest, a kind of layered thing, and they develop their own particular way of doing that through sets of images that allowed them to see things simultaneously through sets of layers. And I'm trying to get to one of those images. So you can see they made a lot of models. And here's their palimpsest device. They had the existing site, some intervention, and then their idea was other things would be added to their initial intervention. So they're just trying to develop a device, a mechanism, a methodology that they could work with to test this idea. And that's where a lot of the emphasis of what they were doing went. Might be a bit different from things that you've seen. So again, that kind of tracing the different layers. I'm going to zip down now to try and get to some things that might look a bit more like a building, but you can see there's just lots and lots and lots of iteration that they're doing, trying to tease out what this thing means in many different ways. And as part of this, they had identified the site, but they also identified the project brief through consultation with local people. They articulate what it's about, why it's there, the sizes of the spaces. So that becomes part of their activity in the studio. And finally, we're starting to get to something that's starting to look a bit more like a building, taking physical form, this long linear element like an armature, or with a number of different appendages or a spine with things that attach to it. And it's connecting this kind of pocket that's on the right-hand side of the image with the water on the left-hand side. And they're starting to inhabit that in terms of thinking about what it means in terms of materials, in terms of activities that go on, particularly notions of thresholds. Again, going back to modeling it in physical form. So we've got this element that's extending from this kind of courtyard left behind over to the water's edge in this long linear element. So their building would have been, I don't know, about 2 football fields long, 200 meters long, so quite a large thing. And inhabiting that in different ways through the use of kind of borrowed imagery, but then zooming back to models. And this is kind of accurately recording. They're just bouncing back and forth between different scales. And I'm trying to fly down now to some more final images, making reference to a number of different precedents and analyzing those precedents in the context of their intentions. So pardon me. do technical studies. There's a whole other book that they did on that, so I'm going to fly through that. But in this case, looking at issues of lighting, the process of making the armature, and understanding how that would be built up over time and things getting added to it. So bear with me. It's a little bit.
That's undergrad, right?
Huh?
Undergrad?
No, this is masters. To make you, don't worry. This is masters, just to emphasize here. I just want to try and get to some final images, but that file seems to have disappeared. Here it is. There it is. It's that one. Well, it's that name. It's that. No, it's this one with that name.
Yeah.
Probably
In the folder?
probably
We're looking for that one.
هو مش موجود دلوقتي.
Takes them to folders. Ah, yeah. That's
Okay, there we go.
these. Start looking at one.
Oh, okay. I'm going to start.
Anything with a dot is like a seal.
No, all right. Well, anyway, no, it's fine. This is an image you've seen, the kind of urban strategy drawing, and then moving into notions of the building. Here they're talking about that process. This is for a competition they entered. And then we get into the building proposition itself, the idea that this armature had actually become the predecessor for a high-rise building, so the structural elements are oversized, and then views of how it starts to be inhabited in terms of commercial activity or markets, all within this armature. So jumping back and forth between three-dimensional imagery and models, and then a final view about how it fits on the site. So that's kind of where they ended up in terms of the work. And there's also a process of going back and reflecting, so they had a whole other document that them critiquing the process they worked with. And then finally, in response to a prompt from one of your tutors, and I need to go back. This file, and do this. So crucial in this is understanding that's the direction those students chose to go. They produced a certain type of work, and they, as part of their development of a praxis, were saying, we really want to explore this idea of this palimpsest, this layering, and how we can work with that conceptually. This is another student's project, coincidentally working with the idea of a line, different project located in Riga, Latvia. This existing bit of land here where we're asked by the developer to look at what could be done. And he also was creating this armature that extended across the city, and elements would be added to it. And what I want to get to, maybe this image, is this one. Da, 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 da. This was, so if the previous students had developed this technique of palimpsest and layering, and it produced this more ephemeral thing, here's a very different thing. And this is how we approach it. We're trying to allow students to formulate their own sense of praxis. This guy was interested in making. How are things made, and how does that physical forming of a building, even down to the level of a detail, inform the overall design of the building? So he spent a lot of time, he's interested in what this project could do to re-stimulate a lost craft of timber or wood construction in the city of Riga. And so his idea was there was going to be this college or university that would support people gaining these skills. And he started to explore at this detail, and this is his drawing, but that's actually taken from the photograph of his model. He developed this whole kit of parts and had detailed it literally down to the screw, the type of nut on the screw, and the type of equipment you need. And what he was trying to do was design it in a way kind of like IKEA furniture. Do you know what that means? He wanted it to be as simple to build as IKEA furniture. So the IKEA furniture approach taken to a building. And this was the model he was making to explore that idea. And that leads to him doing more traditional technical drawings, exploring that, which led conceptually to this idea of a framework and understanding the building made up of these kind of kitted parts, to a series of pods that get produced. And this is a college where people go to learn about timber construction, and the idea is the students would make the classroom. So each year a new group of students come in and they would literally build their classroom across the year. And at the end of the year, the classroom would be done. They'd graduate, bye-bye. The next year's group could kind of house themselves in it while they built their own thing. That was his idea. And so they're, unlike the other one, which was more ephemeral, this was really hands-on, literally, how does part A connect to part B, and how do I take that attitude and design a whole building? And you can see some drawings he explored it in, but then because he was a nifty young man and had lots of skills, that's part of a model he made, exploring the detail. So he was kind of doing it literally a 1-to-1 scale, then he's suddenly making models at 1-to-20 to try and put it together. And then he takes those models, and that doesn't just have a photograph of them. And I'm hoping this one will be it. Yep. And then he takes those models and through a photograph of it, starts to manipulate it to give a sense of what the thing is like on the inside. So that's his praxis. He's interested in that idea of making, whereas the other two students who I spent a lot of time talking about were much more interested in the building in relation to the wider landscape. So it goes back to the very premise question that you guys have asked. How do we compare to students in the UK? Well, you do. You're good students, you're doing good work, great. You compare. But arguably, how you're working, why you're doing that may be different. There's not a right or wrong answer here. I'm not trying to say this is what you guys should be doing. This is us as a school, me as an educator working with students saying, I think this is the way these guys need to work in the UK context because of what's happening with the architectural profession in the UK and the changes taking place. And so we're trying to create this opportunity for them to move from, here's my orientation, to how I start to conceptualize a building, to me developing a working methodology or a praxis to explore that. We're probably a little less concerned with the end product and really focusing on, can you develop this praxis? Does that make sense? So that's the end of the talk. I have managed to finish before 4 o'clock. Really want to open it up to discussion or debate. Congratulations or thanks to colleagues here in the front row who had raised some questions over, I apologize, the too long lunch, but there I was working on my computer in the middle of lunch, very naughty of me. But like these last few images was literally in response to a conversation because I thought it'd end up being a bit one-sided. And the question became, you know, I've heard about this creative practice, but does it deal with reality? And yeah, I think it's a fair question. My comment would be some students choose to deal much more with that physical reality. Some students want to deal with it more conceptually. We're trying to support them in terms of finding that direction. So anyway, that's the finish. Open to critique, questions, comments, complaints, whatever it may be. Thank you. Thank you.
You're doing very interesting stuff.
Thank you. Yeah.
This idea of praxis. I don't wanna waste much time. I would rather have the students lead the discussion. So I'm pretty sure some of you have questions, took notes, I hope. So does anyone have any question to Professor Brown? regarding the totality of what was presented, or maybe a detail of something? I have many.
I hope so. It's daunting. There's, I don't know, 7,500 people in the room. Hard to kind of speak up. Yes,
Yep.
brave man. Thank you. Well done.
تحب نلف؟ تحب ألف أنا وأصور؟ ممكن من هنا.
One semester project.
That project where I showed students dealing with the issue of the line, that was across the whole academic year. So they start project zero while they're away in the summer. I rather meanly kind of, here's the project, show up on day one with your project zero. And then we start talking about it. The film project, Lines of Play, the one where it had the cartoon in it, that was about 5 weeks. But then that overlaps a bit with the main project of the year. So just think of it as we've got a 15-week semester. The first 5 weeks are devoted to that film project, but we start doing the urban strategy project, and that carries up to week 12. So they have about 8 or so weeks to work on that. And then the final building proposition, which I didn't show you as much of, they have another 15 weeks to work on that. One of the things that we are doing with the students is not asking them to work in groups, but opening up the possibility of working in groups. So that students' work, the urban strategy thing was 3 students working together. Huge benefit by their choice. I had to work in groups when I was a student. I absolutely hated it. You know, and it always creates tension. So what I say to them is, if you want to work in groups, fine. If you don't want to work in groups, fine. I think a lot of students choose to, but most of the time it works because they find someone that they really want to work with. They've got compatible ideas. And these students really did. They really, you know, even a graphic style became seamless. You couldn't tell one student's work from the next, which was pretty good going. They really orchestrated themselves almost like an office, and here's the office setting. So they have a lot of time to kind of develop it, but we were having this discussion this morning in the studio, and I think one of the things that we do is we probably spend a lot more time on the conceptual orientation, and you saw all those drawings, really trying to get that right. My argument, usually it works, is if you can get that right, the building starts to fall into place. It becomes so much easier to design because it's so crystal clear. This is my idea, and okay, I have to locate these parts of the building there. There's a phrase in the UK, the tail wagging the dog. The dog should wag the tail, not the tail wagging the dog. And I think sometimes if you try and jump ahead too much, the tail, as it were, starts to wag the dog. You lose sight of the idea. So we spend arguably a bit more time on that conceptual orientation, really trying to tease out what that means. And the building proposition falls into place quickly, probably more quickly in terms compared to the time you guys do it. I'm not saying it's better. That process I'm going through is difficult. It's risky. And all the time, these students themselves are saying, I don't know where this is going. What do I do? Where do I take this? And we're trying to get them to decide that. But it's a really, in presenting this, I've got to emphasize, this is not easy because we're relying upon the student to identify their interest, their orientation, to develop a working methodology and use that to explore a building. And it's so different from the conventional way that they may have done before. And that's scary. And for many students, they come from a background where, okay, I've got a building design, I'm gonna start with a plan. It's a process, you know, with the Bussier, the plan is the generator, understand all that. My personal view, and I'm not saying it's right, so my personal view is when you go to visit a building, what do you look at? I bet you don't look at the plan. I bet you walk, oh, this is a nice space. I like the way that that staircase is cascading down. You know, when you talk about these sets of experiences. So in a way, that's what we're trying to get them to understand. What are the set of experiences, but how do they add up to an overall whole? And the way we get into that is, well, what's the theme the narrative that ties that whole thing together, and then we can start articulating what individual bits are. Does that make sense? Long-winded answer to your question. I was just supposed to say, yeah, it was 8 weeks and 15 weeks, but a longer one.
I have another comment.
Yeah.
I really like how you focus on the process that much, but I want to know what are the challenges you dealt with the students with this whole long process phase? Because of course they get stuck at some points and they come to you and they don't know what to say.
It's a good question. I think one of the biggest challenges is getting them to be comfortable with not knowing. Because they don't know where it's going. They can't say it's one of these. Well, that precedent you're showing me has nothing to do with the line. Why are you showing me that? I don't say it in that way. Say it much nicer. But there's that desire to kind of jump ahead. Oh, I want to get a building. Oh, I'm falling behind. It's like, no, just relax. Trust yourself. And particularly at master's level, look, you've got a set of skills you can work with. You'll sort it out. Don't worry. Don't get frantic. But they get scared, and then they start looking over. Oh, so-and-so's making a movie. Oh my God, maybe I should make a movie. Is that what your work's about? No. Then why are you going to make a movie? Because they are. It's no offense to you guys. Students at my university can really get themselves lined up by what other students are doing. It's like, stop that. They're doing something. Their praxis, their investigation is about something so different. Why are you worried? But they've been conditioned to, so-and-so's doing that, so I should. That's a big challenge. The other thing is, it's easy to fall into a trap of doing it the same way. I'm going to come in and draw a section. I'm going to come in tomorrow and draw a section. And I'm going to come in the next day and draw a section. And after a point, it becomes pointless. You don't get anything back. And so what we're trying to do is encourage them to, okay, you've looked at this section. What does that mean in terms of the model? What does that mean in terms of the plan? What does that mean in terms of a internal perspective moving in the building? And it's like when you pick up an object, you kind of know, or maybe you don't know, and you do this, and you kind of look at it from all angles. You don't keep looking at it when, okay, maybe in a watch I do. You don't keep looking at it the same way. Or you see something new and you're kind of, you're looking at it from all angles. We're trying to get them to do that. And pardon me, I literally will say to students, all right, get up on your desk. Look at your work. Does it look different? Turn it upside down. Walk across the room, 6 meters away. Can you still see what the idea is? Constantly trying to get them to see it afresh. And the difficulty for all of us, it's not just about being a student, for any of us, is we get so locked in. The way I would imitate it, like me drawing or writing, I start like this, and then getting closer. And pretty soon, I'm kind of like this, drawing. I've become so myopic. I'm just seeing such a little bit of it. And I think part of this idea of developing praxis is about how do we learn how to step back and see it differently. And a way we do that, the tools apart from standing up on a desk or whatever, is exploring it in different ways, model, section, perspective, etc. Because it forces you to see it differently. Not because it's, I'm going to draw a beautiful section, hopefully it looks nice, but actually it's just about giving you a different view of it. And then I'll simultaneously, we try to get them to do this, doing things on drawing at the same time. Draw a plan and draw a section right next to it. You would have seen from some of those drawings, we do a lot of stuff that's kind of akin to collage, where there's an image, but then there's another image next to it. And that's how we work in workshop, where they've got a drawing and the model's part of the drawing, or vice versa. We're trying to get them to see things simultaneously, two or even more things, because it keeps them fresh. And that's a big challenge, because I think it's easy for us, and maybe partly because of the way we've been conditioned, certainly pre-university education in the UK is very linear. Do A, do B, do C, don't go off path, come back, do D, E, and boom, 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 and it limits it. And we're trying to say, look around. And you guys have kindergarten, you know what I mean? I often say to the students, maybe you guys will make the same facial expression, but I say to the students and they look at me like, what? I I say the closest thing to what we're trying to do in the MARC studio is kindergarten. Why? Because you play, you explore. You go, oops, sorry, this is a watch, but actually it's a toy. I can flip it. Or, woo. Hey, come on. That worked, huh? But it's about being kind of, that one movie was talking about play. We're trying to create this atmosphere of play where you say, what if? I'm just going to explore it this way. And that's hard because most students, and certainly you've gone through the UK education system, does not welcome play. You start off in kindergarten, you're doing all this fun stuff, and then you get to first grade. All right, everybody line up, wear a tie, or if you're school outfit, only speak when spoken to, blah, and you take all this creativity and go, and by the time they get to us, yes sir, no sir, and so what we're trying to do is get them to remember that idea of play. And that's hard, because it's just, it's been beat out of them by the education system. Not all people have that, but many schools in the UK are kind of, they're so worried about results, and getting the right marks, etc. They forgot the idea that play is actually a very good way of learning. So we're trying to get them to remember that. And what's scary is how sometimes students resist play. I don't want to do that. No, and it's a scary prospect for them because they're so conditioned to, you tell me what to do and then I'll do it. And we're saying, I'm not going to tell you. I don't want 30 Bob Browns. One's enough. You tell me what you want to do. And some of them just haven't been asked that before. So that, again, that's scary. And I think part of our role is just about providing a space of reassurance, of comfort that, yeah, I can take a risk, I can play, and I constantly say to them, look, if you take that chance to keep playing, something good will come out of it. You just have to believe in yourself. But it's easier said than done.
I have a follow-up question to that. So I'm not sure if that's explicit thing about talking.
Would you mind raising your voice a bit?
Yeah, the follow-up question for that is, it's not. I'm not sure if you can talk about like how explicit or implicit the idea of talking through what they are doing. It's like the meta ideas, like talking about what they are doing and what they are not doing, and whether that's a good thing or not.
I think that's a really good question, and your school attracts students from the region, parts of Africa, but a lot of them are from Egypt. Our school's maybe a little bit more international in terms of the percentage, and one of the challenges is we get a number of students from Southeast Asia, and students from Southeast Asia, and I include my wife, who's Japanese, and this every day is a learning process for me. They don't think, they trust their bodies a lot more. They value the role of the body in learning. It's not that Rene Descartes worldview of I think, therefore I am. I think, but also I use my body. And you think about Japanese art forms or the tea ceremony and so forth. It's all about the role of the body, and they're cultivating a sense of how the body moves, but it's about cultivating a body awareness, which I certainly wasn't brought up with that. So they have a different way of thinking. So it can be problematic if I were to say to a student from that cultural background, okay, I want you to write, I want you to articulate it in that way, because it can be a challenge. But what we then try to do is say, okay, can you make use my wife as an example who teaches in the school. She gets the students to make things because she understands that way of thinking. She literally, if you give me a project, I'd probably start doing very first instance drawings, 3-dimensional kind of axonometrics or something, because that's the way I think. She would start by getting 2 bits of stuff and start playing with them, putting them together. So we try to recognize that there's different cultural backgrounds and say, okay, these guys are happy writing, but can you try something else? And those particular two students I showed at the beginning were very much into the written word as a way of teasing out ideas. They wrote very well. One of them happens to be doing a PhD with me now, and that comes comfortably to her, though the artistic side does. Whereas this guy, much more of a maker. So in tutorials or in workshops, we're trying to throw different things at them. You know, want you to write a bit of text and make something, like with the Project Zero. There was a bit of text and a physical thing. So it allows students who have different ways of working to kind of rely upon their strengths, but simultaneously trying to get them to push something else along.
Right.
So I think that
Is that forced, like at some point, is that like through like a, I don't know, group discussion or something, like let's think about the way we're thinking about what we're doing, or is it just it's a free range, everyone does whatever they want?
Probably yes to both. We have discussions with them generally
Right.
about how we're working,
Right.
but then an individual tutorial also try to talk to them about
Support their ideas.
what's the way that you're working. You know? And so we have discussions about the ideas, but we also have a lot of discussion about how are you working and why are you doing that.
Right.
To get them to become more in control of it.
Yeah.
So they understand what it is they're working with, whether it's making, writing, whatever it may be. And it's what they end up doing is a process of negotiation.
Right.
We don't say to them, hey, go off and do whatever you want and we'll see you in 6 months.
Right.
That'd be interesting. Haven't tried that one yet. But this is, it's a constant kind of revisiting. What are you doing? Why are you doing it? And it doesn't happen at the beginning of the year, like that student who did the thing with line and fishing. I just said, do a thing about place.
Right.
She came up with, she didn't know why, this idea of fishing. And so we started talking about why fishing? Why do you value it? She, in discussion, talked about how from childhood she'd done this fishing, out with her grandfather, etc. And we tried to, not just in one discussion, over a number of discussions, interrogate that. And what emerged was this idea that here she is standing on the shore with a fishing rod and a line that's allowing her to connect to something else. And then with that I said, gosh, that reminds me of your work last year. Why don't you go back and look at your work in the frame of the idea of a line connecting from one place to another. She came back, oh, you're right. And I said, why don't you go back and look at your work from your BA studies? And then she came back, oh God, you're right. There it was. And so what we're trying to do is, again, cultivate that awareness, but that's not one conversation.
Right.
That, in answer to that question, how long does it take? We're really trying to keep revisiting that, to refine that discussion, that understanding. And it takes time. It's easy for me to look back at all this stuff and go, yeah, we did this and this and this. But I didn't know at the beginning what the fishing thing was going to mean. It was in conversation or dialogue with her, it got teased out.
It's not like in the forefront of your mind that we go through, like it has to go through this period and then we sit down and talk about what we did. It's not like that. It's just
There's a
organic.
series of prompts we give them
Right.
to help generate discussion, and then, okay, you've done that, now go away and do some more studies
Right.
that helps further tease out that idea.
But how like what are your thoughts about like whether an explicit approach to that would be like rather than, I mean, I guess it's beneficial to leave people to work on their own and then cultivate what they've worked on instead of like having that in a planned way. People would work and then come back and talk about the work that they did, not about how they thought about it rather than
It's-
working.
I think I know what you're getting at, but I think it is planned in terms of we do have
Right.
kind of an overarching process. But the process that we have is meant to allow students to find their own way.
Right.
And then again, we have these periodic touchstones or touch points where they're coming back to us where we have a dialogue or we're prompting dialogue with others.
Right.
And that helps tease it out. And I think probably the very same thing you guys do, we're trying to get the students to talk to each other.
Yeah.
To not see us as the fountain of all knowledge, because we're not. But rather to see everybody else in the room as a possible kind of place where creativity can spring from because they're having a dialogue. And that conversation makes them see something about their own work differently. And that's probably very sane.
Right, yeah. Thank you.
Following up on Sameer's questions, to what extent do you think there is a possibility that, I mean, yes, you're in your studio, master design studio, you're trying to get your students to discover, explain, discover, understand, and explain their design process, their praxis. To what extent do you think your own praxis and through the overall actually system you created for the studio, the submissions, the requirements, the stages, you're influencing their own praxis?
That's a very nice loaded question. In case everybody didn't hear that, how much of my own praxis is influencing the students? No, I think it's very fair. I do say to them, look, I'm not trying to make you into me. I'm very emphatic about it. When I first started teaching, I tried to be neutral. And over time, I realized that was pointless. I can't be neutral. I mean, I bring with me X years of experience. Why should I ignore that? And actually what I found over time is students value that. But also, further to a conversation we were having earlier, I'm bringing other people into the studio, so they're being exposed to a range of views, not just me. And I'm very clear in emphasizing to them, look, if I show them like a lecture or some paper I've written, this is me. I'm not asking anybody to deal with this. I mean, it doesn't matter. That doesn't become the criteria by which you're evaluating. What I am trying to do is show them stuff that I do to prompt them. That's the intention. The reality is, about 10 years ago, that when this student, I'd encourage to do this, what I'd call an exploded axonometric. It's kind of an axonometric, but you pull it apart into pieces and allows you to see certain relationships. And that was very important to that student's drawing with this idea of construction, which you would have seen that earlier image. And word spread in the student, Bob likes exploded axonometrics. And boom, there it was. And it got to the end of the semester, and I came in, and they'd been there the night before, pinning everything up. I came in, and it was actually in the atrium where there's this bridge you walk across. All the work that they'd done was spread out on the other side. And I exploded axonometric, boom, 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 boom. And I thought, wow, we've got a school, look at this. And literally in that same instance, I said, oh my, what have I done? And it scared me. I mean, it was interesting that they'd all kind of taken on board this way of working and worked with it, and it was valuable. But I was like, wait a minute, don't think that somehow you're going to get marked better because I like exploded axonometrics because it's what I draw. Yes, it's useful, but it's useful if it's relevant to your idea. And then what became really dangerous is there were all these MArch students with exploded axonometrics at kind of Christmas time. And by the end of the year, you went to see the BA undergraduate work, and there were all these exploded axonometrics. And so these things have a way of kind of acquiring a life of their own. And with some of the exploded axonometrics, they started getting more and more complex and visually incredibly enticing. Wow! But they started to not make sense. So I can't even read this. This looks, this kind of drawing looks fantastic, but what the heck is it? And there's a danger of these things, they just become almost like a formula or a graphic style. And at that point, we collectively, students and I, have to take a step back and say, why are we doing this? And I've seen that happen with other things, not just the exploded axonometric. There's a student who had done a drawing, and he was interested in materiality. We were working in Porto in Portugal, and they're very into that kind of earthiness of things. And the food's like that. Just a real substance to the food. And so for his drawings, he started doing scans of pieces of concrete and rusted metal. And then he was using that scan in the computer, and he was doing different things with washes to create an aesthetic effect on the drawing. And it was really nice, but it related to his interest in materials. Well, you know what happened? Suddenly there was students with just blotches of color appearing on their drawings because they were scanning, you know, whatever, and they thought it looked cool. It's like you're missing the point. So you're constant. You know, we're asking the students to critically reflect. The staff, we have to constantly critically reflect. You know, are we doing things that exactly what you said are unduly influencing them, and that it's no longer about their praxis; it's becoming about mine. It's just a good point.
Just even at perhaps a more higher level, you can argue is architectural design about what I like, or fishing, or materiality, or is it about the people who produce the building, or is it about the environment, or so even the essence of where praxis begins is getting completely different.
And I think one of the things that, picking up on that, I can tell we need to go, picking up on that, one of the things we're trying to do, as I said, we're trying to get the students to cultivate their own sense of self, their own praxis. To that end, there's me, there's a colleague who comes from a lot more of an artistic background, there's a colleague who's very much into building performance. We have this guy who worked in industry, who comes in periodically as an environmental engineer, a landscape architect, so constantly throwing different perspectives at them. And what we're trying to do is get the students to say, you know, where do you fall into this? Are you somehow pulling bits and pieces of that together? And I think it does go back to this question asked. It's hard because it requires them to, you know, ask that question, well, actually, what is it that I want to do? And, you know, and I'm being presented with all those, oh, I like that, oh no, I like that. They've got to go through a process of soul searching to find themselves and how they might work with that. Easier said than done.
Yeah.
You got mine? Can we take one more question from the audience? And I have one.
Okay.
You have elaborately answered most of what I had asked. So, but I'm pretty sure that someone out there has a question because, yes, Abdullah, thank you.
So, with the projects we've seen some great emphasis. Okay? Yeah. Okay, so that's what we've seen some great emphasis on the design process and even planning the design process and the research and so on. So, within the studio, the education studio's time frame, where's the timeline which is like, that's enough research, that's get into, it's never enough, but within the studio's time frame, like.
Yeah. No, good question. Lots of good questions this afternoon. I think the answer to that would depend on who you asked. My view is there's no point where you go, okay, I'm stopping and now I'm doing my final presentation. I would argue you're just going to keep working, and we're trying to get them to do nice work the whole way through, but you're just going to keep working and you're going to get to a point where time runs out. But hopefully the work is well crafted enough that it communicates something about the proposition, but try to get them to understand, okay, 3 weeks before the end of the year, stop and do the final drawings. You know, really pushing them to keep going. You can imagine they hate me at this point. Whereas some students very clearly kind of go, that's it, I'm done, and they disappear. I don't see them for the last 2 weeks. And I think they're going, I've had enough of Bob. If I go in, he's going to keep pushing me. I just want to get this thing drawn up, and that's fine. You know, it's about that they're taking control of their process, but that's fine. So again, it depends on who you ask. And it also depends on what they want to have up on the wall. This guy had what you would recognize as a very standard presentation, some fantastic models, some really nice drawings or photo montages of models, and it looked like, here's the finished product. The two women whose work I showed earlier, they had, from a space from about here to here, giving them that much room, they had a timeline. And then the timeline was a set of different models. And then they had coming off that timeline, here's the drawings and models we did at this stage, here's the drawings. And so they didn't really present it as the final project. What they did was they literally showed how they got from here over to there over the course of the year. And that was pertinent to them because that's what they're evaluating, this process. So they're trying to communicate that process. So again, it depends on how students want to present themselves at the end of the year. In a way, it doesn't surprise me that that student who did the thing about the process, the line, one of them has ended up doing a PhD with me. She wanted to keep working with it. She didn't want to let it go. Whereas this guy, highly skilled, went off working in practice, has done really well, and he's got a slightly different mindset. And so again, we're allowing them to make a decision about how they want to present themselves, which goes back to that issue. It's kind of scary. Well, what drawings do I need to do? I don't know. It's your project. You tell me what you need to, and they're not used to that. Some of them are used to be, you have a 1 to 1,000 site plan, or 1 to 500 site section. It's more set out in that way. We're just saying, you decide. So I don't know. It's asking them to take ownership. And part of my argument is, and this is the final year. I'm like, you're going out into practice now. I'm not going to be there to tell you what to do. You decide, because this is what you're going to have to do. So we're trying to cultivate that sense of ownership and that sense of control over that work. And again, it goes back to what I was saying earlier. Sometimes students resist that. Tell me what to do. No, you tell me. So, but yeah, I think it's a fair question. But we're trying to get the students to make a decision on that.
I think Abdullah's question has led directly to mine.
Okay.
And I think it would be a boring question to most of you, but I think it's important that issue of, you talked about your relationship with the student in terms of how you educate and what you're trying to teach them and how you're trying to inspire them. We have the issue of grades. Yes, grades. And we have, the issue of grades is a twofold thing. You have the issue of grades as in, you want to fairly and properly evaluate the work that you have, while allowing them to have these different routes that they take to reach the product. So that's one issue of a grade. And then the other issue is if you have the same structure as we do, where you are to report in with grades for the university, for the logistical fold of the issue. So would you mind addressing that, and how are you able to maintain that fairness throughout? Did you get my question?
It's a complex question. Unfortunately, it's going to take a bit of time to answer. I'll try to be brief. I know the university would like us to have it more prescribed and just so finely tuned, like a mathematics test. But that's never going to work in architecture, and particularly given the way we're working, which is so loose, so open-ended. I think if they really knew what we were doing, they would probably, wait, well, you can't do this. Also emphasize to the students that while there's the RIBA criteria, which structures what we are marking them on, also they are being marked by their own agenda. So this guy saying, I'm interested in construction and how that forms a building. Well, what we're looking for is how he's explored it in construction. If he's showing me a bunch of drawings of the elevation, sorry, mate, doesn't work. Whereas, he very clearly worked with a set of tools that were appropriate and worked with it at varying scales to explore what it meant in the way of the building. And so, again, they are defining the criteria that we are using to evaluate them. And this is where it gets a bit confusing, because then there's another student, like the previous students doing the stuff about landscape. We're not asking them such detailed questions about the detail. We're saying, how does this thing connect to the wider landscape? Because that's what you set out to do. So the student's agenda defines what it is that we are then starting to evaluate. Yes, there's specific criteria in the way of the RIBA, but the overriding thing is, I, as a student, am interested in X. Okay, that's what we're going to evaluate. Does that make sense?
Yeah, very much so.
You understand that. You certainly understood it. But we really struggle with getting all of the students to understand that, because they've been conditioned to think there is a set thing that you are marking me against. Where is it? No, you are defining the agenda. That's what you're using. What do you mean? And it's hard to get them to appreciate that they themselves are their own judge.
Yeah.
One of the things we've tried to do over the years, but we're kind of moving away from it, is getting them to evaluate their own work. And like I said, with the other students, they went back and they did this process of reevaluating their own process. But it's too close. They've just finished it, and then we're saying go back and evaluate it. And they don't have the distance yet. I think if we went back 2 months later and said, could you do it, they'd be more comfortable. But doing it right when they finish, they're too tired, they're too close to their work. It's hard for them to do that, and I understand. But in an ideal world, they would become their own critics, because that's part of having a praxis. But we haven't solved that one yet. I know our colleagues tried to get fellow students to assess each other. That's been a disaster.
But that was part of my question when I asked about like whether they sort of think about thinking for the design, because that requires the self-critique they have to be aware of.
We're asking them to do that during it, but by the time they get to the end of the year, it's they just want to finish, which I understand.
Everybody wants to.
And so that we've tried that, but like I said, moving away from that, it's problematic. But it's a tough one. I think there's another side of this. I'll just quickly add. The other thing is we are trying to work alongside them. We're trying to work alongside them like a colleague. And that's difficult because they're used to a tutor, a professor. And that you develop this kind of working relationship, and then all of a sudden at the end, all right, now I'm going to give you a mark. And so I've been your best mate, and now I'm the stern grandfather. We haven't solved that one either. And I think the students are doing really well have a handle on what they're doing, and they're usually their own harshest critic. And the students that are kind of doing okay, they've got a sense of it. It's unfortunately the students who are struggling a bit that aren't able to put the work into more of a context. And those are the ones that are probably have less of a handle on where the work sits. But I don't think that's anything new to us. It's probably true everywhere. But it's I think the overall comment would be it's a struggle. We're still trying to get that to work out. And I don't know if we've completely sorted it.
Thank you very much for your elaborate answers, your in-depth insights, and I ask you all to join me in thanking Professor Brown for his very in-depth story about what's happening in the UK, and I actually think we do compare. So I think discussions in the future could help us see eye to eye. Once again, I ask you to join me in thanking Professor Brown. And as usual, I would like to take a picture. So if you don't mind, Professor Brown, you sit here. Okay, it will allow us to take a picture with all the group and people standing in the sides, behind the columns. If you don't mind, if you just join us for a second. Voila.